Well, welcome back. So far this week, we've been talking about Paul's injunction to Timothy on how to conduct himself in the church, and that was the reason why he gave all of the characteristics and qualifiers of those who would serve in leadership. And as leaders, they were to be mature Christians who could really illustrate by the way they lived their life how everybody else was supposed to live their life. We have a crazy dynamic about leadership in our culture today where most of the time we find that leaders see themselves being in a position of power where they can be the exception to the rule. So, at the same time that certain leaders are telling us that we should be riding bicycles and keeping a small carbon footprint, they're jetting around in private jets, creating a massive carbon footprint. And we recognize that there's kind of an inconsistency and a hypocrisy of it, but the answer they give is, well, my needs are greater than yours. And I've seen that kind of dynamic happen in the church as well. I remember one particular pastor who was on the Christian TV who talked about how that he needed his followers to buy him a $40 million Gulfstream 4 so that he could cover the world more quickly because his time was so valuable and precious. And I'm thinking, you're not saving that much time and you're consuming a great deal of money. Private jets are not just expensive to buy, they're expensive to fly. But you see that kind of thing, and you realize, no, that's not right. Something's not making sense here. And so Paul was saying, Timothy, you need to make sure that those who are leading are living their lives in the same way that the people who are called to follow them. They're setting example, that they pray, they read their Bible, they go to church, they walk in grace and love towards other people, they serve, they sacrifice, they give, all those kinds of things. One thing I realize is that there is nothing that makes me different or better than anybody else. That all I am is, in many ways, I see myself as a talking head, and one day God will puncture my balloon and the air will go out, and that'll be the end of my earthly journey. And it may take a few weeks for people to forget that I was ever here, but the truth of the matter is somebody else will step in, Lord willing, if we're to continue on in this planet. And it'll just continue to go because we're essentially, we may be called to hold a certain place in the church, but that's what we are, is we're placeholders. I remember one of my first elders said to me that he said, you always need to remember that it's like putting your finger in a glass of water, that when you put it in, it may look like you've displaced something significantly, but as soon as you pull that finger out, the water goes back and fills the void. That's who all of us are, and we should never forget that that's what we are. We aren't essential, and there is no people who are non-essential. The body is essentially a unit, and if one part suffers, Paul said to the Corinthians, the entire body suffers. If one is glorified, then we're all glorified together. And so that equality, I think, is really getting lost in the mind of many Christians. And I would quite honestly say sometimes it's really a little bit embarrassing when people treat you like you're better than them, or like God hears your prayers faster than He hears theirs. I mean, I like being respected, I like being treated nicely, but the simple fact is, in the end of the day, we're all sinners saved by grace. And as Billy Graham pointed out so effectively, he said, God doesn't answer my prayers any faster than He answers yours. So we need to understand that. The role of leaders is to be an example of what everybody else is supposed to be. And they are not the exception to any of the rules. All of the rules apply to them equally. Now, as Paul goes on in verse 16, he adds this, he says, beyond all question. In other words, he's saying, this is something that we need to be in total agreement on. This is kind of like a fundamental truth that we all need to embrace. Because previously, remember, yesterday we talked about how that the church is to be the pillar and the foundation of the truth. And so if we're going to be part of that foundation of truth, there's certain things that we have to be in agreement of. And he begins to go into what was probably a hymn that was sung in the early church when he says, the mystery of godliness is great. And he begins by saying the greatest mystery of the godliness is that He appeared, speaking of Christ, He manifested or became visible in a body. Now, to many of us, we have heard about the incarnation of Christ and the idea that God became man. We understand, having read chapter 1 of the Gospel of John, as well as the first comments in 1 John, that Jesus was a man, and they seem to make such an emphasis. And we wonder, why was that so necessary to point out that Jesus was a man? Even the idea of being born of a virgin becomes quite critical, because he had to have a human body in order to become the sacrifice for the sins of the world. But again, what were they up against in their time when they were making these statements? And I think that it's important for us to recognize that false religions at the time had tended to do one of two things with Jesus, and this is still true today. They either make Jesus extra human. That's what the Gnostics did. They described Jesus in bigger than life terms. And many people don't understand the problem of the Gnostic Gospels. They portray Christ as being extra human, like superhuman. In fact, one Gnostic Gospel even said that Jesus only appeared to have a body, but he was actually not embodied like we think. And so when they hung Jesus on the cross, they didn't hang Jesus there. They hung Judas Iscariot, and that was a great ploy that Jesus played on mankind, fooling them into thinking that they were killing him, but actually they were killing Judas because he was unkillable. And it's amazing, because you find that this theology has gone into the Coptic church in Egypt. It's part of the Gnostic theology, the Gnostic Gospels. Remember the Da Vinci Code and Don Brown and all that. This was a theological concept that Jesus was superhuman. He was a superhero. And like the Gnostic Gospel of Peter, where it says that, or Thomas, excuse me, it says he was sitting by, at 5 years old, he's sitting next to the creek, and he's making little birds out of mud and then breathing on them, and the birds fly away. It's kind of this ridiculous kind of extra exaggeration of who Jesus is, so he doesn't become a real person. He becomes somebody we worship, much like we would worship any idolatrous being that we could think about. But at the same time, we find the other extreme is to make him less than what he was. And the idea was Jesus was just a man who attained to godlike qualities by hard work and self-discipline. Again, one of the Gnostic teachings was that Jesus went to India and studied under the gurus, and he became just another guru, like, Krishna or Buddha in particular. And that whole idea that he was an ascended man. And you have whole groups of religious teachings that basically say we just need to learn to have that discipline and develop what they call the Christ consciousness. Now, when I heard the phrase Christ consciousness, I thought, oh, you mean being conscious of Christ, continually conscious of Christ, and being constant, continuous communion with Christ? No, that's not what they meant at all. They meant basically, as one guy put it, it's like the second coming described in Matthew, where the clouds part, but this time the clouds part in your mind, and you realize that you are the Christ. He is Christ, I am Christ, we are all Christ. We just have to recognize the Christ essence within us. So these are the two directions. They either lift Jesus up to a ridiculous point of being non-human, or they push him down to being nothing but a human, and each ends up denying who he truly is. That's why we find, for example, John starts his first letter to the church by saying, that which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we've seen with our eyes, which we have looked at, and our hands have touched. He had material essence. This we proclaim concerning the word of life. The life appeared, we have seen it, we testified to it, and we proclaim to you the eternal life, which was with the Father and has appeared to us. We proclaim to you what we have seen and heard, so that you may also have fellowship with us. So fellowship with Christ is predicated on the recognition of who Jesus is. And that's how he opens in verse 1 of chapter 1 of 1 John. He goes on in verse 1 of chapter 4 in the same letter saying, dear friends, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits to see whether they are from God. Because many false prophets have gone into the world. And this is how you can recognize the Spirit of God. Every spirit that acknowledges that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is from God. But every spirit that does not acknowledge Jesus is not from God. This is the spirit of Antichrist, which you have heard is coming and even now is already in the world. So Here we are, he's saying, we need to recognize two things. Number one, he was fully God, but he was also fully man. And false religions either try to make him only God or only man. And that's how we recognize whether something is true or not, whether it's biblical or not. This is the foundation of the whole Christian life. It's the foundation upon which all biblical truth rests. Anything outside that is not biblical truth. I hope that's clear. We'll pick it up tomorrow. Thank you.